Hello. So today we're going to take a voyage through time. We're going to take a look at the past, present, and future of how we compose applications for the web. Before we get started, hello, Lisbon. Thank you so much for inviting me to LXJS. I've been trying to make it for a couple of years. I'm glad I made it today. Everyone here seems awesome. For those who haven't heard of me before, my name is Addy Osmani. I work on the Chrome team. I work on a number of open source projects. Feel free to hit me up on Twitter later if you've got any questions. At the start of the web, at the very, very start, going back almost 20 years, back when the standards kittens were first putting it together, things were a little bit simpler. Back then, if anyone mentioned the term big data, they were probably talking about Star Trek and not something that they talk about today. In those days, when WebMD was only starting to come on the scene, a lot of people thought it was pretty cool. I think these days, if WebMD actually launched, their slogan would probably be, it could be nothing, but it's probably cancer. In those days, if you saw an illustration like this on a plane, you'd probably think, oh, look at that pregnant lady. She's got like a baby and it's singing and stuff. These days, it looks like she has a fantastic Wi-Fi signal. And back then, we didn't know that apparently 11% of Americans think that HTML is an STD. So if you're traveling internationally, please try to avoid saying, I'd like to share my HTML with you. It might just worry some people. Back then, our pages were much simpler too. We had form, we had select. We built our pages out of these tags, and they had meaning. They had encapsulation. They had default UI. They'd inform the page when something interesting happened. Now, the way that we build our pages these days is a little bit wonky. We tend to litter our pages full of JavaScript plugins, fill them up with bloated CSS libraries, and in some cases, both. I think that we can do better. I think that we have a chance to do something a little bit better than what we have right now. What if we had the ability to fill in the gaps in functionality in HTML with our own custom tags? What if the language was expressive enough to give you that capability? Well, there's a set of standards called web components that are enabling this in browsers today. And they're ushering in a new era, a HTML renaissance, if you will, where we're starting to look at whether we can solve problems a little bit better in a declarative fashion. The cat with a gun on a unicorn is particularly important here. But we think that this is going to be a little bit better. Now, before we can actually see where we're going, we've got to go back in time. Understand where we've been. So this is Google.com today. Let's go back in time. It's Google.com back in 1998. How many people here were building for the web back then? Around 1998. Good number of people. Now, if you were building for the web back then, your pages probably looked a little bit like this. You're probably using something like Netscape. Your pages probably looked a little bit simple. Now, because we're developers, our pages didn't look like this. They probably looked a little bit more like this. Your page isn't complete unless it has a baby dancing around some fire. Elements are the building blocks of the web. We're still using a lot of these things today. Let's take a look at something you all use, something like the select tag. Now, elements are encapsulated. When you dump the select tag on a page and you include some simple child options on it, you get something with some nice default UI. You don't even have to use CSS to get that. There's no JavaScript involved. You're just using plain markup. And you're getting a functional piece of UI on your page. Elements are configurable. This is your typical scenario of running out of T-shirts at a conference. Everything is gone except for that extra, extra large. Probably the same situation as LXJS today. But in this case, you dump in the disabled attribute on any of your child options, and instantly the UI changes once again. It's aware of what you're trying to do. Again, not interacting with CSS or JavaScript in order to get this in place. Here's an example of using the multiple attribute. When you add this to the exact same element, it automatically knows that the context of what you're trying to do is changed. You're no longer just trying to select a single item. You're trying to select multiple items. And again, all I'm doing is I'm configuring this element using an attribute-based API. It's very, very simple. And it's already changed what the UI looks like. Elements are composable. In this case, we've got the exact same tag as before, except we've placed an options group in there. Now, in this case, we're getting a slightly more complex UI. And again, we're just using markup. It's declarative, it's readable. A designer can come to this and actually understand what's going on. And elements are programmable. Despite markup and a declarative way of doing things still being great, you can still interact with this using JavaScript. You can still access anything on the API through script. And of course, select, like many of the other elements that were originally around, it's got like a nice rich DOM API. It can emit events letting the page know when something interesting has happened. Good design doesn't date. There's a reason we're still using a lot of these elements in our pages today. So what happened? Well, let's take an element like tabs. Tabs are a pretty quintessential component on the web today. We've all built a tab component at some point or used a plugin for this. Now, building a tab component has changed over time. Originally, probably started with a lot of markup and maybe initializing it using some JavaScript, maybe using a jQuery plugin or something similar. But over time, we've added more and more and more, and even more of our logic directly into script. This last example is LXJS, where we're constructing most of the element in JavaScript directly rather than using markup. And this feels a little bit weird, because we're piling on the JavaScript, and our HTML ends up being terrible. This is gmail.com today. I have no idea what's going on here at all. I don't know what these classes mean. I don't know what NH means. I don't know what NN means. I don't know what's happening here. There's a class called NO, which I can only assume means you shouldn't be doing this. I mean, look at the suffering it causes. It's making babies cry, polar bears. I think we can do a little bit better than this. What if defining tabs on the web today look a little bit more like this? This is very readable. You can see instantly, looking at this that we're trying to build some tabs. We've got a parent set of tabs, and then we've got individual items inside of it. It's easy for anyone to write code that a browser can understand. But really good developers write code that people can understand. And when I say this, I'm not necessarily talking about like the average person on the street. I'm talking about other people on your team, people that are going to have to maintain your code over time, designers, other teams inside your company. Now, web components are a set of emerging standards that basically allow us to extend HTML with our own vocabulary. They're composed of 4 core specs. There's templates, which basically allow us to do templating, client-side templating inside the browser without having to rely on a JavaScript library for this. So we're able to stamp out a piece of DOM and say, well, maybe I'd like to use this later. And it'll only be rendered to the page once you've activated it, saving you the need to go and use libraries. Custom elements allow us to extend HTML's vocabulary with our own custom elements, our own custom tags. Shadow DOM gives us, for the first time in history, the ability to properly scope DOM and CSS without having to rely on things like hacky iframes. And HTML imports are sort of on the back of all of this. For the longest time, we've been able to import in style sheets, import in script, but we haven't been able to easily import in HTML. Imports give us a way to package together the logic for a component. So the CSS, the JavaScript, the markup, and just import it so that we can start using it in a page. Now, web components are an encapsulation mechanism. They're not a panacea. They're not going to solve all of the problems that we have today. They're just helping us take existing patterns and formalize them a little bit better. So let's take a look at some examples. What if we could bring back the blink tag, the tag that time forgot? More pages need the blink tag today. But if you take a look at the source, all we're really doing here once we've imported in the component is defining it in markup and consuming it. What about something like charts? I have a hard time configuring charts. I hate having to muck around in JavaScript to do that. What if we could just use an attribute-based API to configure visual components like this? We go and we inspect something like, I think this is a donut chart here. And if you take a look at the way that we're configuring this, we're just using attributes. We're passing in an array of values, and it's doing all the rest of the work behind the scenes. It's actually quite pleasant to use. You could imagine someone on your team actually using this without too much difficulty. Someone in the community decided to rethink how we do things like animated GIFs. So the animated GIF, so you usually just use like an image source when you're trying to specify a GIF, but that's actually pretty limiting. So you're probably used to doing something like this. What if we actually had the ability to do things like control the speed of our animations and allowed our users to be able to do that just by providing an extension on the image tag? What if we could do things like synchronize animations to audio? So in this case, we're actually synchronizing an animated sequence to a piece of audio. So the jump is in line with the actual audio occurring behind the scenes. What if we could give you an easy way to stop and start animations? How many different UIs have you seen lately where we've got like social networks where people want to be able to use GIFs, and yet we end up having to transcode them to video files or build completely different elements just to be able to stop and start them so we don't end up flooding our pages full of large animated files. What if we could smooth over features that are already in the platform using elements? So in this case, I've got a video camera tag. And if I want to, if I wanted to actually just include the ability for someone to take a photograph inside the browser, you just drop this tag in your page. You don't necessarily have to muck around with get user media. You can also abuse tags to do whatever you want. So here I've created a Miley Cyrus tag. And because I can hide functionality behind the scenes, I can hover over it. Do something like this. I think this is what the web was made for, just pure abuse. You can also do really neat things, like music visualizers. In this case, if you take a look at the source, all I'm actually doing here is I have a tag where I'm just specifying source equals pointing to like the audio file. So this is halkyan on and on. So I'm just pointing to the audio file. It's a relatively pleasant way to do things. Now at Google, we've been experimenting a little bit with the sort of web components paradigm. And we realized we've got a lot of APIs. We've got over 250 APIs. What if we could actually smooth over how people use them? So this is typically how you do something like Google Maps. You'd include some JavaScript on the page, referenced from one of our CDNs. You'd probably go and start configuring it. You'd have some placeholder markup on your page that you'd go and initialize as a map. It's a little bit hacky. What if all you had to do was just import in a Google Maps element, and then you could start using it on your page? You could then go and start configuring it using attributes. So just passing in a lat and a long to configure the map that you're getting back, configuring the zoom levels, and so on. For anyone that wants to check out the work we're doing on that, it's all on GitHub. It's at github.com/Google Web Components. We've got elements for sign-in, interacting with calendar, sheets, and a few other APIs. Now, something that's exciting to me is Dmitry Glazgov, who's one of the fathers of web components, said, custom elements is a bedrock API. We should be able to build all HTML elements with it. I thought that's kind of exciting. And it's exciting for a few reasons. Recently, on the Chrome team, we've been investigating an idea called Blink in JS. And the idea behind Blink in JS is, what if we could give developers a way to extend the features that are in Chrome, the native features in Chrome, just using JavaScript? Imagine if you could say, OK, well, I've noticed there's an issue with this particular element. I'd actually like to go and open up a pull request on GitHub to fix it in Chrome, in JavaScript. So the first pieces of work around this have started landing. We're currently investigating re-implementing in a spec-compatible way the marquee tag using custom elements. So the top one is actually the native implementation, and the bottom one is our own custom one. And this is on GitHub. You can actually go and take a look at how this is progressing and contribute to an element that's going to be in Chrome. I think it's kind of exciting. I'm somewhat blown away by the idea of us being able to go and author features in Chrome just in JavaScript. I think that's kind of cool. So let's talk about native web components. So what we're used to using in our pages are something that look a little bit like this. We probably add some CSS into our page. We initialize some markup on the page to use a plugin of some sort. And maybe we interact with it using JavaScript. Using custom elements, it's a little bit more straightforward. We have an import. So in this case, we're importing in a widget we want to consume on the page. And then we just define it. So my widget is an instance of that element, and I can start using it. I can start configuring it right away. What about creating a custom element? Well, in this case, we have a new method that's been introduced. It's currently in Chrome. I think it's being implemented in Firefox and a few other browsers as well. But it's register element. And register element basically allows you to go and register a new element for usage in the page. The spec says that you need to include a dash in the name. One of the reasons for that is to allow sort of standards bodies to continue working on sort of more terse names without overlapping and clashing with them. So in this case, we've registered an element, and we can go and start using it. What about extending a custom element? Well, in this case, I'm using register element once again, but I'm passing as a second parameter an object with a prototype in it. And the prototype basically specifies what we want to extend. So in this case, I'm trying to create a new mega button that's extending the existing HTML button. And I can then start using it inside my page. This form of extending elements is actually somewhat nice for progressive enhancement, because if a browser doesn't happen to support web components and you're not using polyfills for it, it'll just degrade back to the standard button. Let's take a look at that. So here's our regular button. And once it's been extended, I can actually go and do things like, why wouldn't you have a cow? Let's talk about callbacks for a moment. So if you're defining your own attribute-based API, you probably want to also be able to react when an attribute changes. So let's take a look at an example of this. This is a CSS Lego man. And he basically has a shirt that we can configure the color of using a property called color shirt. Now, when that property changes, we'll get a color shirt changed callback being executed. And we can go and perform some additional functionality there. So in this case, I know that he kind of likes hot pink. So I'm going to replace this with hot pink. Everything is awesome. Everything is cool. Sorry, I can't play more than that for legal reasons. But you can also style custom elements as well. So in the same way that you'd probably go and style like the button tag or video or one of the other existing elements, you can also style your own custom elements in a very similar manner. You get the ability to use these selectors, which are fairly straightforward. You also get the ability to define things like shadow boundaries. And a shadow boundary basically refers to what's inside of your element. So you're able to control what gets rendered inside the element and whether CSS actually leaks outside or not. We can take a look at an example of that. So here we have a custom element that's on the page, and then we've got some other text that's outside of it. And we're basically reusing the exact same IDs and classes in both cases. So inside the element, my messages are scoped. So the color of my messages are set to purple, and they're scoped within the scope of my element. And so those are going to be purple. As you can see, however, on the outside, that isn't impacted in any way. And the reason this is particularly useful is for things like third-party widgets, where you don't want them infecting the rest of your page with their styles or their DOM or their style sheets. And it's a little bit more pleasant to use, and you get more granular control than you get with iframes today. Now, cross-browser support for web components isn't there just yet, but we're working on that. And one way we thought would be interesting to accelerate our way to use web components today is by creating a library called Polymer. So Polymer has been a project we've been working on the Chrome team for a while. It's basically a library that uses the latest web tech to create custom HTML elements. And it's got a few different layers to it. So let's take a look at the layers that form Polymer. We first of all have the native layer. And that basically represents a browser that has all of the abilities, all those 4 specs that basically represent web components. We then have the platform layer. And the platform layer refers to polyfills. So Polymer comes with a set of polyfills that basically take your current browser and make them as close as possible compatible with the web component specs. We then have a set of Polymer sort of syntactic sugar on top of that make it a little bit more pleasant to work with web components. And finally, we have elements. We're going to talk about elements a little bit more in just a moment. So let's talk about using elements. Now, one of the things that the Polymer team believe in strongly is the idea that everything can potentially be re-envisioned as an element. We're going all in on this declarative metaphor. So these are the HTML elements that you're probably used to using. You're used to using some that are visual, so things like the progress tag, details, input, video, and also a few non-visual elements, so things like script and style and title. Now, in the Polymer world, we have sort of similar concepts. So we have a range of different core elements that are very much visual. So you can decoratively configure things like animations. You get the ability to use primitives for things like collapsing things. You can decoratively do drag and drop. You've got the ability to use things like splitters, toolbars, range selectors, and a number of other different components. We also have a set of non-visual elements. And the idea there is trying to smooth over some of the functionality in the web platform that could be a little bit more pleasant to use. So some of these thought experiments might seem a little bit weird, but they're actually quite nice after a while. So this is an example of local storage. So local storage, you probably are used to using it. Generally speaking, you use like get item and set item to configure it. What if local storage could be re-envisioned as its own tag, where you're able to bind the value of what's getting saved locally to any field on the page. So in this case, I can go and I can type in something like LXJS, and say I'd like to persist it. And when I refresh the page, that value is still there, just using a tag for it. Let's talk about composability for a moment. So I believe that good engineering is making a design work with as few new pieces as possible. Now, if you're used to working in the node world, this is a concept that you might feel a little bit more familiar with. But composability is great because it allows us to build functionality just using existing little bits and pieces. So core selector is a Polymer element that we consider a little bit of a primitive. So in this case, I basically have a list, and I can go and I can select different items on it, or I can select multiple items on it if I want. It's nothing too exciting. But you can actually go and reuse this piece of functionality to build more complex pieces. Think about tabs. What is a tab? Well, a tab is very much like a list. It's like a list that's laid out a little bit differently. But if I'm going and I'm selecting items on it, it's more or less a list, right? And I can extend the core selector to create tabs in like 3 or 4 lines of code. Core pages. Start to think like what we can reuse this functionality for. Things like slideshows. We're basically working against a list. We're just changing some CSS to say whether a panel is hidden or not. But we can also create slightly more pleasant, like interactive pieces of UI that are essentially just lists. And we're building on top of this primitive. Menus are a very similar thing. So in this case, we're using core selector for menus. So we're using it for tabs, pages, menus, transitions. It's kind of interesting. Let's talk about layouts for a moment. Now, I personally find it a little bit tricky to use CSS Flexbox. I keep having to go back and forth trying to figure out, okay, well, what is the latest spec, and does the browser I'm using actually support the latest spec, and how do I do things with it? We tried to re-envision what Flexbox would look like if it was just something you configured using attributes. So in this case, I've got like a little div, and I'm just saying, well, I'd like to use the layout system in Polymer. So I'm just dropping in a layout attribute on there. And because I want to lay this out horizontally, I just dropped the horizontal attribute on there. And as you can see, we have a nice horizontal layout in place. I'm not having to go and customize any additional CSS myself to get this in place. I go and I change that horizontal to a vertical, and my layout instantly snaps to a vertical layout instead. I can also change things like the flex positions on individual items within that layout. Now, this is basically me whenever I think about vertically aligning anything in CSS. It's painful. It's a lot like birds attacking you in a park. And so we started looking at whether we could help with this problem as well. So in this case, this is axis centering. So we've got the layout, we've got the horizontal attributes on this tag once again. In this case, we've just added center on that. And so along the axis, we're able to just say, okay, well, I want you to centrally lay this out in a particular position. That's not good enough, though, because generally speaking, you run into this case of having to want to center things absolutely dead center. And so this is sort of the holy grail, where you're able to just pass in attributes and say, well, I'd like to also center this justified. So just using a few attributes, you're able to get something that is dead set centered without having to go and touch CSS yourself. I think that that's kind of cool. And I would try it out. Let's talk about responsive design for a moment. So a lot of us are building multi-screen experiences for the web today. We actually started looking at whether this problem could be made a little bit more pleasant using declarative syntax as well. And so we have a core media query element that allows you to basically say, well, if a particular media query is matched, go and use a particular layout for the page. A very simple demo of it might look a little bit like this, where I'm just opening up DevTools. Let's dock to right. And as I change this, it basically switches from phone to tablet to desktop layouts. That demo is kind of boring. So let's look at a different one. What about art direction? So you could probably use a similar setup to do something like responsive images. So in this case, we've got a slightly different art direction. And as we know, when you're using a mobile device or a tablet device on the web today, the experiences could be a little bit better. So this is reflective of it. So that's the tablet view, and that's the phone view. And it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse from there. Now, on the Polymer team, we thought it would be interesting to also explore the idea of a designer app. We know that whenever someone says, hey, go use my new library, you don't necessarily want to go learn off all the syntax right away. Maybe you just have 10 minutes. Maybe you've got 15 minutes, and you just want to try it out, or prototype. And so we created a designer application that basically allows you to go and use all of our different elements in a UI. You can go and you can add your own elements to this. But the basic idea here is that so here, I've got an application builder. I want to go build a mobile web app that'll look great on tablet and on a phone. And so I'm going to go and I'm going to drag and drop. This is like a scaffold for a web app. I'm going to go and I'm going to change the title a little bit. Maybe I'm feeling lucky. Let's go and build a YouTube application. One thing we're probably going to need is some way to input text. And so we've already got an element for that. Let's drop it on the page. And we can go and see, we've got a styles pane and a properties pane. And the properties pane automatically picks up all of the different attributes that this element is capable of configuring. We've got styles here as well. You can go and you can configure, the different styles for this element, its layout, where it snaps to, and so on. So we've got an input field. We're also going to want a way to interact with the U2 API. So we've got an element for that too. In this case, I'm just going to configure it so it's a little bit wider. We go back to the properties field. We see that we've got an attribute here called I'm feeling lucky. And I can actually go back up and I can bind the value of I'm feeling lucky to my input field automatically. I'm not touching any code just yet. I'm basically saying, OK, well, I'd like to bind it to the input field. And now, whenever I go to my text field and I type in, something like Back to the Future, it just works. In this case, it's showing me everything wrong with Back to the Future in 8 minutes or less. But yeah, it's kind of pleasant being able to just go and prototype with elements that you or your team have built. And a number of companies are actually trying this out at the moment. Salesforce have actually built a whole set of their own elements that they're playing around with on the Designer app. So you can go and check that out later. Let's talk about creating elements for a moment. Now, one of the reasons that I like using Polymer is that it takes a lot of the boilerplate that we have when we're trying to write custom elements, because there is a level of boilerplate involved. It makes it a little bit more pleasant. So in this case, when I want to go register an element, I just use Polymer-element as the element that I'm using. I can pass in no script if I'm not actually interacting with any JavaScript. And Polymer will automatically create Shadow DOM out of the first template included within this element here. And as you can see, I'm including some markup and some styles. And this is basically now a scoped component on my page. These styles are not going to go and leak inside the rest of the page. So that's kind of nice. What about declarative extension? What if you didn't have to go back to script to go and extend an element? So in this case, I'm using extends equals core selector. So we're building tabs. And we're extending that core selector component that I talked about a few minutes ago. And the amount of code required here is actually not that much. There's a little bit of extra CSS I'm not showing here. But I'm basically going and I'm saying, well, any content that's in the Shadow DOM for this particular element, so if you define tabs in your demo file, it'll go and project them back into here. And it just works. I don't have to go and muck around with the prototypes at all. We've also got support for binding expressions, so data binding. And I'm not going to show you too much of this. There's actually a lot more complex stuff that's possible. So in this case, we've got a value that we'd like to use inside of our template. And we're using sort of handlebars or mustache type syntax. And we're just binding this to a value being passed inside of our element registration mechanism. And it works. It's just, anytime this particular property changes, it's just going to update the template inside of my element just to keep them constantly in sync. We also have support for published properties. So throughout this talk, I've been talking about the idea of attribute-based APIs and being able to just configure pieces of UI and pieces of non-visual elements using attributes in the same way that you would with like the select tag. So in this case, I'm saying that the public API available allows you to go and use an attribute called owner. And when a user passes in a value for owner, it's going to override any default values you have. And it'll just bind it the whole way through your element. So here, I've said, OK, well, there's a default value of the owner being Addy. But when I go and I actually define an instance of my element, I'm passing in owner equals Alex. And that's overriding it. So any user can go and use an attribute-based API to configure this element. We've also got support for something called automatic node finding. The idea here is that developers are generally used to, as much as we like query selector and query selector all, we're still somewhat used to using like a jQuery API for doing things. And this is kind of pleasant because let's say that I go and I have like an input field inside of an element with an ID of like name input. Well, inside of my element itself, I can go and I can just use this dot $. To go and access name input. I don't have to muck around with query selector directly. You can if you want to. It's all supported. But this just makes saving yourself on boilerplate a little bit more pleasant. Now, yesterday at Google I/O, we announced something new, something I think is kind of exciting. It's a new project called Material Design. It's a vision inside of Google. And the idea is that we want to help not just like Googlers, but all developers build experiences that are sort of ubiquitous, experiences that transition well across multiple devices. So if you're building something with a rich experience on desktop, we want to make it a little bit more easy for you to transition those experiences across tablet and phones so that they're still pretty fast and still perform at 60 frames a second. Now, we're also trying to go a little bit further with the types of animations and types of interactions that we're used to seeing on the web. We really want to demonstrate that the web is capable of a lot more than we're used to seeing. we're looking at whether we can make it more pleasant to do things like meaningful motion. So when a user is trying to transition from one interaction, one view in your application to another, what if configuring something like that could only be done in like 3 or 4 lines of code in a declarative way, using declarative syntax? We're trying to look at how we can ease things like adding delightful details to your apps. So when a user goes and maybe clicks on, hey, I'd like to go and check my inbox, or I'd like to go and post a message to something, what if we could actually make that experience a lot more rich without putting too much effort in on your side? Well, there are a number of Polymer elements that were released yesterday in developer preview that try to help with this. And they include a number of different things that are kind of interesting. The first is an effect we call the ink effect. And the ink effect just basically has a point of origin concept to it. So this is using Canvas behind the scenes. But the idea is that when you interact with your application, you have a single point of origin, and the animation animates from that point onwards. We've also got other elements, so things like radio buttons, toggle buttons. We've got things like tabs, where we have ink effects. So again, these point of origin effects that are just baked in for you. And you can go and you can easily customize these. You can change the colors and the behaviors. We've got helpers for doing things like depth. So adding cards to your application, adding depth, so that the user can actually try to feel like the application is a little bit more physical than some of the things we're used to seeing. We've got things like toast notifications already baked in. We've got tabs, sliders, progress bars, and a number of other elements that are available for you to go and check out. Now, we thought it would be interesting to actually go and build a real-world application with this. And so yesterday, we open-sourced our first sort of complex app built using the paper elements, and it's called Topeka. If you've got some spare time during the rest of the day, Topeka is basically a quiz application. And I think that the people in this room can probably beat everybody that's a Google I/O at this quiz. So you can go and check it out on GitHub. We've got links to it on the Polymer site. But the idea here is that we actually demonstrate how easy it is to do things like delightful transitions, delightful interactions that you can go and check out. I'm going to mess up this quiz so badly. But it's actually relatively nice taking a look at the source for this. I'm not going to cover it, but this is actually also the world's first application to fully integrate support for Service Worker. We're going to be adding details for how to get that set up. You still need to use Canary with a few different flags and things turned on. But I'm not going to talk too much about Service Worker. It's basically got support for it baked in end-to-end. So do check out the source for it a little bit later if you're interested. Material design is all documented on google.com/design if you're interested in learning a little bit more about our direction there. You can find out more about Polymer on polymer-project.org. We recently set up a site called webcomponents.org along with Soledad and some of the other folks at Mozilla and Opera. And the idea there is that we want a single place where developers can go to learn about the sort of best practices around web components and help us evolve what they are. Because it's still early days, and a number of best practices are still very much evolving. But you can go here, you can go and find like elements built by the rest of the community. You can help us out with trying to document best practices. And you can find out like any slides and articles and new stuff that's being posted about web components in the community. Hopefully you're a little bit excited about some of this stuff. Please help us go componentize the web. And that's it for me. Thank you.